Hi and welcome to my channel, or welcome back. So this is my May 2022 wrap up, and well, the thing is, I am not going to talk about all of the books in equal lengths in this video, because I already talked about the first 6 books that I finished in May in separate videos, and I will link those videos in the description box below if you are interested in checking those out. But yeah, I think I will just sort of mention those first 6 books really quickly in this video as well. But before I go into go into the details of the books, I would say that May has been a wonderful month for me in terms of reading. It is also the first month since I resigned from my job, and I'm currently not working. I am staying at home. I'm taking care of a family member, and so that sort of means that I have more spare time to read, which sort of explains how I ended up reading or finishing 9 books in May. But yeah, it has been lovely. There were some slumpy moments here and there in May as well, but you know, that sort of thing is just kind of normal anyway. But yeah. Anyway, just a quick review of the first 6 books that I read in May. By the way, my so-called quick review of the first 6 books that I've read turned out to be 20 minutes long, and so if you're not interested in these, you can skip to the last 3 books that I finished. I have the timestamps below. Feel free to click away. The first one was An Unnecessary Woman by Rabih Alameddine. This book is about an elderly woman who lives alone in her apartment in Beirut, Lebanon, and she occupies her time with translating works of literature. This woman, her name is Aaliya. She is a person who is a bit of a snarky old woman. She's very cynical and very critical of other people as well. And as we read her story, this book is sort of like her internal monologues of sorts, the entire book. We find out more about what happens in her past and how it sort of intertwines with the family drama that she has experienced, and also the armed conflict that has troubled Lebanon and Beirut especially in her past. So I think this book is really wonderful because it has a really wonderful voice. I feel that you can really see the character Aaliya in front of you as she gives her opinion, as she tells her story. It's just really engaging. So I give this one 5 out of 5 stars. So really highly recommend. The next one I read was by Caroline Blackwood, and it's called Great Granny Webster, which is also another book about an elderly woman. Also about an elderly woman who is a bit of a misanthropic person. This elderly woman, her name is Great Granny Webster. She lives alone in her old and damp and dilapidated mansion in Hove in England, and she is visited by her great-granddaughter one day because the great-granddaughter is sort of convalescing, and she needs some sea air to treat herself. I mean, this is the early 20th century. Anyway, the great-granddaughter learns more about this great-grandmother who apparently has been sort of a mythical figure, larger-than-life character that has been sort of whispered about in her family, but she has never really seen her before. So she's really fascinated by this Great-Granny Webster, who is apparently someone a bit of an eccentric person. And she learns more about this grandmother while living with her. and at the same time still having certain aspects of her life remain a mystery. And then she also learns more about what happens, the history of Granny Webster's daughter, grandmother Don Martin, the great-granddaughter's grandmother. I hope I'm not confusing you. And also grandmother Don Martin's aunt, not aunt, daughter named Aunt Lavinia. And all these three women apparently have their lives all intertwined together, especially the latter two, who sort of dealt with mental illness in their life. So it is a nice, quirky, gothic, and at the same time somewhat of a serious, bleak novel. But at the same time, I feel that it is a bit it's a bit too short, and so I don't feel that enough description or enough human qualities, humanities are injected into these three characters, and so they sort of remain as a figure that looms like a larger than life personage. And at the end, I just didn't feel very satisfied by how the story is being told to me. And but overall, it was nice, it was quirky, but it was just not really there. So the next one I read was Anna Kavan's Eyes. And this book is a bit of a strange book. So this book is about a man who is pursuing a woman, and the world the story is takes place in is a bit of a world that is slowly consumed by the cold climate. Basically, ice is starting to encroach the lands, and it is really disrupting the politics, the economy, and the social aspects. Basically, it's affecting every single aspects of human life. And so in certain places, the society has sort of become very chaotic, and there are chaos everywhere. And so this unnamed man is pursuing this unnamed woman because he thinks that this woman is needs his protection, and he pursues her all the way until into a strange country that country, it is not entirely ruled, but he comes across a warlord, someone he refers to as a warden, who also exerts his power over this woman, strangely. Now, this entire book feels somewhat dreamy, which I think is something that I like, although I also learned that dreamy books aren't necessarily well-written books. But definitely not the case with this book. I think this book is really well written. There is a lot to unpack in this book. It seems that this book has been labeled as a dystopian fiction, psychological fiction, whatever fiction. It's really hard to categorize, but after finishing this book, I wouldn't say that I enjoyed it in a conventional sense, but it really got me thinking as to what this book is trying to tell me. And overall, I really appreciated the kind of things that I sort of had in my mind after finishing this book. I have all these thoughts being stimulated by this book, and so I really like it. I really like how this book just sort of portrays this woman who is being pursued as someone who is wayfish, someone who is frail and fragile and pale and fair, and those and pure, those kind of imagery. But somehow reading this book, we really sympathize with this woman who is running from whom, running from what, we don't know. But we later find out why this woman is running, and it feels a little bit like a wham moment. So I really like this book for that reason, and also how this book sort of touches upon the question of masculinity versus femininity, and how what's going on in the world in regards to violence and human activities, and how human conflicts can sort of spill over to various aspects of the world. And this book was written sometime after the World War II, like the couple of decades after World War II. Not a couple of decades. I think it was just one decade. I don't remember. But it was sometime after that, and at the onset of the Cold War, and so you definitely get those vibes into this book as well. So it's really wonderful. I really recommend you guys check it out. After that, I read a completely different book written by Haig. It's called How to Stop Time. This book is a bit of a fluff for me. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars because it was just, right there in the middle. It's about this man who apparently can live a very long life, and at the present time, in which this story takes place, he is already about 400 something years old, and because of his condition, he has experienced a lot of persecution in the past. Because many people sort of deem him as unnatural, and he also learned that there are other people like him as well who are sort of living in this shadowy sacred lives as well. And another condition that apparently he is facing in the story is that being someone who lived a very long life and sort of tied into this shadowy organization in which he has to do things that they ask him to do because he's asking a favor from these people, he cannot fall in love. Why? Well, read the book. I thought it was okay. It didn't really try to go like really deep into certain things. I guess it tried, but it doesn't really go into like really emotional, really really slice really deep into the soul of how it feels to like live as a 400-year-old person. I mean, it probably works for this book, because if there is a part in which this book suddenly goes into philosophizing mode, that would be sort of weird, honestly. But in any case, I think that this book is sort of a relaxing read. It's an okay book for me. I think if you want to read something that feels somewhat light, you can definitely try this one. Next one is not really a light book, and this one is called The Discomfort of Evening by Marieke Lucas Rijneveld. This one was originally written in Dutch, and it was translated into the English by Michele Hutchison. This book, it feels somewhat heavy. We can certainly sense this discomfort looming around this book. So basically, this book is about the death of the son of a family, the eldest son of a family, in a skating accident. And the story takes place in a Dutch village, rural area. And the protagonist of this book is this young girl named Yas, who at the beginning of this novel, because she is so concerned about her pet rabbit being killed for dinner, she prayed to God that God would take her brother instead of her rabbit. And turns out her brother later would die in a skating accident, and she feels really guilty about that, and she's sort of dealing with that whole guilt and grief in her own way. But at the same time, her family is also dealing with the grief and loss, and her family are dealing with those things, not exactly in a very unhealthy way, which sort of influences the children, their surviving children as well. And because their surviving children sees how their parents are sort of dealing with the grief in such destructive ways, their surviving children are also starting to not only deal with the grief, but also to deal with the parents in unhealthy ways. So basically, this book is about people dealing with stuff in unhealthy ways. I think that this book is certainly very poetic. Certain part of this book feels poetic, and it makes sense because the writer is a poet also. And I really like certain parts that are being used to convey grief in ways that I think considered to be somewhat unconventional, like animal cullings, like what happens with Yas and her jacket, and also her constipation. I think that is really creative. But at the same time, I also find it kind of tiresome that this book keeps on mentioning animal deaths and also bodily fluids repeatedly in such, I personally would think, to be gratuitous. So yeah, I feel that certain part feels a little bit overboard, and I just never feel shocked in the beginning anyway. It just makes me feel bored, so that's the effect. Anyway, I think you might want to consider this book if you're interested in reading a book that deals with grief and loss. But overall, it was not exactly a very engaging book for me to read. It felt a little bit tedious and tiresome, but overall it was fine. It was fine. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. And the last of the 6 books I read, and that would be The Return of the Soldier by Rebecca West. So this book is about the return of a soldier from World War One, and the war has not ended yet, but he returned because he apparently is experiencing shell shock, and he is discharged, and waiting at home are her cousin and her wife. But the problem is this soldier is experiencing certain kind of amnesia in which he forgets everything that has happened in the last 15 years. And so when he returns home, he does not remember his wife or his marriage. And at the same time, he is really still very much in love with his old flame 15 years ago, another woman who has apparently gotten married and become of a lower class person as well, person of a lower class in society. And so this whole thing causes a lot of drama, especially among the women who were kind of happy that he is back home, but at the same time has to deal with this whole memory loss. And a certain character has to make a very important decision that would pretty much be the core of this novel. I think that this book has it portrays an event that could possibly be melodramatic, but I think the story itself is not melodramatic at all. It is dramatic for sure, but it also is told in this like really controlled and very well-paced manner, and also very reflective as well, as the narrator of this entire book is actually the cousin. And I really like the kinds of revelations that we get from this book, especially the revelations that occur among the different characters, especially the cousin and also the old flame. I find that there are some really interesting discussions about what's the meaning of happiness in this book, and how this book also sort of touches upon the idea of class injustice, and what it means to be someone of a upper class versus a lower class person. And yeah, and also this book is about choices as well. Really important choice that happens towards the end of this book, which I think makes this book like so much of a drama, but one that is not melodramatic. So yeah, those are all the 6 books I have read in first 6 books that I've read in May. Now I'm going to talk about the remaining 3 books in probably greater detail than the first 6 books. So I am going to start with the next book that I finished, and that would be Lovers in the Age of Indifference by Xiaolu. I was actually at a state of slumpy mood when I first started this book. I was reading another book and I was like really bored, and this book sort of changed my mood because this book was so interesting. This is a collection of short fiction. You can say that it's a collection of short story, but some pieces are like really short. They feel more like just a piece of fiction, but yeah, you can consider them as stories. Anyway, this is a collection of short fiction, generally about characters being in love or having relationships with each other, or pretty much just exploring the idea of love, trust, and relationship in general. But what ties this book to these stories all together is that the love that is being explored in this book is not necessarily a love, or I would say love stories that would end in like really happy note. Much of this book feels sort of gloomy. For some people it might feel depressive. There is a certain kind of emptiness that these stories convey also, but at the same time there are certain stories that just feel that gives you this feeling of calmness and tranquility, this contentment. So it's definitely a mix of feelings, but definitely not feelings that are like really extreme, like extreme elation or extreme sadness or stuff like that. Definitely a book that you would want to read if you're feeling relaxed. But I wouldn't say that this is a right book if you're feeling somewhat hollow, or if you're not feeling good, if you're feeling somewhat depressed. Maybe don't read this book at that particular time, because some of the stories in here do feel sort of gloomy. Yeah, and as usual, because it's Xiaolu, she experiments a lot with form, with style. So definitely there are certain pieces in this book that definitely have like they're not written in traditional prose. One of the stories I remember is written in the form of a series of text messages. Another one is just a series of emails. Yeah, and so there are different styles as well, and of course there are traditional prose in this book also. But yeah, I think that this is a really wonderful collection by Xiaolu, and definitely want to read more of her stuff in the future. I mean, I've read her novels as well, they are really good. And yeah, I'm really happy to have read this one. So after that, I finished a book that I have sort of started reading since March, I think, and that would be a non-fiction. It's called Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places by Colin Dickey. And the main reason I was interested in reading this book was because I am someone who is interested in ghosts and ghost stories and supernatural stories and their origins and histories as a whole. So that was my main motivation in reading this book, and I must say, after reading this book, I was quite satisfied with how this book turned out to be. There were a few expectations that were subverted, which I thought was great. Now, this is not a book if you want to, this is not a book to read if you want to be spooked. if you want to be scared, or if you want to read ghost stories, or it is also not exactly a book if you're a serious skeptic and you just really want to see someone debunk certain stories really hard. This book, it takes a slightly different approach. It you can feel from the tone of this book that the writer is in fact someone who is a skeptic, but at the same time this writer is not someone who really insists on telling the readers that these stories are fake or bogus and stuff, but rather he would go into these ghost stories that are related to certain haunted places in America, and he would tell the stories and then offer an alternative rationalization as to why these ghost stories appear. And often the rationalizations that he provides tend to be quite rational. It makes a lot of sense also, but he does not try so much to say that how people come up with these stories are like dumb, stupid, superstitious people, but rather he comes from an angle that focuses more on the history, the economy, the social setting in which these ghost stories takes place. And for me personally, it really makes sense that certain ghost stories appear because they are kind of like the manifestations of the society's collective anxiety about things that they feel uncomfortable talking about, things like racism or something horrendous that happened in the past, like massacre, or in America, the slave trade. So these are really like sensible explanations as to why these ghost stories appear in the first place. Another thing that I sort of felt kind of surprised is that certain ghost stories appear because there are some mercenary motivations behind them. Like, for example, certain tourist attractions that are said to be haunted, the ghost stories are fabricated so that people would be more intrigued to visit those places, and of course more money would come in. And also at a slightly different, from a slightly different angle, certain ghost stories appear because it has, the places associated with the ghost stories are sort of involved in land disputes. And it's sort of interesting that how land disputes and land ownership, house ownership, is sort of related to the idea of a place being haunted. It's like, for example, the Salem witch trial, which I actually I sort of knew about this before I read this book, but it was also referenced again. Part of the motivation or the driving force in that trial was certain parties wanted to grab another person's land. So this book elaborated that quite well also. And overall, I think that this book is just a really nice book to read if you would want to sort of appreciate the ghost stories themselves without the ghost stories being discredited heavily, and at the same time also read about the kinds of alternative explanations that could possibly explain the origins of these ghost stories without really I would say without really ruining the mystique around these stories. So yeah, one really wonderful book. But yeah, before I go to the next book, I must also add that I think American ghosts are not so scary. And they are also not very interesting. I mean, American ghosts per se, they are not really interesting. And another thing that this book highlights is that much of the American ghosts are very non-PC. Like, even though there are many horrible things that happen in the past in America, you know, things that happens to the indigenous people, or during the times of slavery, for example, much of the people who suffered from these are people of color, but then the ghosts are overwhelmingly white. So that was interesting. Anyway, moving on to the last book I finished in May, and that would be Man Tiger by Kurniawan. Actually, I have it here. Man Tiger by Kurniawan. So this book was originally written in Indonesian and it was translated into English by Labodalih Sembiring. And this book is the second book by Kurniawan that I've read. The first one was Beauty is a Wound, which was awesome. That one was translated by Annie Tucker. This book is also nice. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, but it wasn't as captivating as Beauty is a Wound. It also has some references to things that are a bit more fantastical, but they are not really stretched like Beauty is a Wound. I mean, I noticed that I've been making comparisons a lot with Beauty is a Wound, as if this book cannot stand by itself, but I feel that it's so difficult to not make that comparison because I really love Beauty is a Wound. Anyway, Man Tiger is about this young man named Margio who lives in in an Indonesian village. One day he's usually known as a nice, kind, gentle boy, young man. But one day, suddenly, he goes to another neighbor and he literally bites the neck of that neighbor, essentially killing him. And it was so surprising to all the other villagers, and everyone just pretty much feel that it's so strange why this would happen in the first place. And so this book basically tells us the story behind what causes Margio, someone who is just pretty much innocuous looking young man, to suddenly do this kind of act. And one of the things that we are teased on is that apparently inside Margio there is this this spirit or a soul of a female tiger. So what's up with that? Now, after finishing this book, and it is a really short book, by the way, I sort of read it fairly quickly. You know, the idea that there is a female tiger within this young man is really interesting, and it sort of opens up promises of things that are fantastic or magical in the story, which is certainly something that I really love, especially for a story taking place in Southeast Asia. There is a lot of magic in Southeast Asia, by the way, which sort of makes American ghosts look kind of pale. Anyway, but yeah, I was expecting something like that in this book, but I was sort of, I mean, I wouldn't say I was surprised, but maybe just very slightly disappointed that what happened in the end. This book is a really grounded book. It is based on really real and understandable human motivation, human drive. So in that aspect, I think that this book does that really well. It explains the reason why Margio would do such a thing in this like really logical fashion that would sort of makes you understand why certain things happen. But at the same time, it also causes the inclusion of this whole female tiger thing feel somewhat redundant. Like, you probably can do away with that female tiger. um, and that's just my personal opinion. I think that this story is in fact a very grounded book, a very realistic book that doesn't really need any kinds of magical element in here, and I felt sort of cheated by that. Anyway, I thought it was a nice book. I still gave it like 4 to 5 stars. It has some nice writing, nice story in general. So yeah, still would recommend Tiger, but I would definitely recommend Beauty is a Wound much more. Anyway, that's all for all of the books that I have read in May, and yeah, I guess that's all. I'll see you again in a different video, so until then, take care, thanks for watching, and bye!